Hello and welcome to Unwasted Pain. This is Karin Conlee and I'm sitting here with Chris Conlee, and this is episode 2. So thank you so much if you watched episode 1, and I hope that started to lay a foundation of really kind of the direction we're going throughout the duration of this podcast. But there's probably nothing that people share more in common than pain. It is a part of the human experience, and we can't live in this fallen, broken world and not experience pain. But I really think the question is, and one of the reasons why you wanted to offer this podcast is because the question is, how do you deal with adversity? How do you deal with pain in your life? And so, Chris, I know we gave kind of an overarching story, and we even have thunder in the background as a sound effect as we're recording this for the doom and gloom of pain in your life. We couldn't have timed that better if we'd wanted to. But in all seriousness, we kind of laid the foundation last week, and then in these next couple of episodes, this will evolve over time. We'll have guests and different people who can speak to different ways that they have overcome adversity and overcome pain. But in your own personal story, one of the reasons you wanted to do this particular topic and theme for a podcast is because you have experienced a lot of adversity, and by God's kindness, you have been able to see God in the midst of that. And so today we thought we would really kind of look at the topic of tragedy, and in the context of maybe somebody has lost a loved one, whether that be through a long journey of illness, or in your case, it was sudden and unexpected with the loss of your brother. And so maybe just to give us a little bit of a context of that part of your story. I know the Love Works documentary, if you haven't checked that out, it will be on YouTube at the Vision Video channel starting Father's Day 2023. And it is explained in greater detail there. But for the sake of this podcast, just maybe give us a little bit of what that phase and that part of your life looked like when your brother died.
Yeah, and when we talk about tragedy, I remember very early when God called us to ministry, I naively thought, well, that's just something that happens every now and then. And I wish that were true. But unfortunately, what I've learned through, 25 plus years of ministry, and, the larger that a church becomes or the larger your ministry becomes, there's just more people that, are in the circulation of your life. And you just realize that unfortunately, tragedy happens every day to somebody. Mm-hmm. And so instead of us thinking that we're just going to be lucky enough in life to avoid tragedy, we have to learn, how to work through tragedy, mm-hmm. and how to grieve when we need to grieve, and how to help others overcome tragedy. But one of the things that I think our culture has done, and I think this is accidental and stuff, but like we've allowed tragedy to kind of take a permanent hold in our life, that once we experience a loss in some way, it feels like we've kind of given up on healing and on our ability to be overcomers, and we hang on to that loss in such a way that actually the past becomes paralyzing. Mm. And so, I think it's important, whether you've had personal tragedy or not, or let's just call it adversity. Tragedy is a strong word, or crisis, whatever that might be. Whether you've had that or not, all of us are going to experience some level of adversity, some level of crisis, and at some point, because it is appointed unto us once to die, like the loss of loved ones, that's going to happen. We need to talk about this in such a way that we're not devastated, and we don't grieve as people without hope, but rather we grieve with healing in mind and with hope in front of us.
It's interesting that you said that, because I do see there's this sometimes, something happens and it's like, it's true, you were never the same again, but that doesn't mean that you can't heal and be an even stronger person. So there is, I don't want to minimize the pain, but I just thought as you were saying that, you're right. Sometimes it's like that becomes a wound that never heals. And yet at the same time, I think the other maybe parallel unhealthy track of our culture is also like you just box it up. And it's like that happened and we're not going to talk about it again. And I'm going to just move forward as if it didn't happen. And so like there's got to be a healthy way that's not forgetting that it happened and also not carrying it with you forever, that I think is what I have seen you experience, and why, though you have gone through more than most people's share of adversity, that you're able to be as healthy as you are and you're able to help other people, because it wasn't we forgot about it, and it wasn't it's going to be with me forever and I'm never going to be okay.
Well, and what's important to remember, let's take the example of losing my brother in a car train accident. Just to set the stage for that for a moment, he was 18 years old, 8 years older than me. I was 10 years old. It was probably, in all probability, the best day of his life, because he was an aspiring college golfer, and this was his senior year in high school, and he just shot 64 in a high school golf match and was, riding on cloud nine, and was coming to tell my dad and I, and on the way to see us, there is this tragic collision with a train that takes his life, and the greatest day becomes the last day. But it was a day that it wasn't just a tragedy to me. Sometimes that's what we've got to remember. Mm. It was a devastating tragedy to my dad, to my mom, to my sister. It was a tragedy to his close friends. It was a tragedy to, just even a community. And so there's times that everyone processes that a little bit different. And depending on how each person processes it, honestly, depends on whether that person remains hurt or whether that person is healed. Whether or not, the enemy uses this tragedy, to set someone even further back, or whether or not God's allowed to heal and redeem that, restore that, and actually propel someone forward. And so when we think about these tragedies, we're never supposed to grieve alone. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes what happens when, a crisis hits, adversity hits, we retreat and we actually start secluding ourselves, and we begin to grieve alone, and that's incredibly unhealthy. We were never meant to grieve alone. I think a beautiful picture of that is, it even talks about that there will be a day when God wipes every tear from our eyes, that He is close when we are experiencing loss. And not only is He close, but He wants other loved ones and friends to be close. And so I think maybe the first step to grieving is we have to, even though we're devastated by the loss, we have to somehow, some way actually believe that there is a God. And this is where the confusion sets in, because people say, how can a good God allow something like this happen? Mm-hmm. Well, He created a perfect world. Unfortunately, through us choosing sin, we allowed it to become imperfect. And then in that imperfection, there are things like unexpected crisis, unexpected tragedy that happens. He didn't will that to happen, but He cares more than we care, and He is there to heal us, and He is there to begin to restore in every way possible.
So Chris, I'm just thinking about people watching this and the different dynamics that exist. Maybe you could speak to the fact that you were 10
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of a different dynamic to be obviously a mother losing
Yeah.
a son, or even an adult losing a sibling. For somebody that maybe, again, the thing that I think ministry teaches you is, even with the example of your brother, that day, everybody else's world continued on.
Yeah.
Like, people were probably frustrated that they couldn't get across the railroad tracks because there was an accident there. Like, how many times do we in our own life, like, that's such an inconvenience, but for somebody, in a traffic accident obviously
Right.
is my example, for somebody their entire life changed in that moment. And so it happens all the time. What would you say to someone that maybe in that context of a child that loses somebody, and what were the nuances that you, now looking back as an adult, would say, okay, this is what I wish somebody knew about my situation, so that they can maybe be that person and be that help to another family that's lost someone?
I would say it's important to validate every feeling that someone's having, but just try to point their feelings to God, where ultimately they're looking to God as a caregiver, as someone who cares about their feelings. And so even in that situation, as a child, of just impossibility to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. You just can't even potentially believe that this is real, that this actually happened. You go into a level of shock, and then you hear everyone else just talking about, how can this be, and how unfair is this, and why does something like this happen, and why do bad things happen to good people, and all of those are legitimate, but especially as a child, but I think anyone needs some help thinking about this from a God-centered perspective versus just a man-centered perspective, meaning that I'm only looking at it from my perspective. And so, like, one of the things I would say is, okay, if you're angry, be angry. But even in your anger, turn it to God and say, would you just help me process my anger? Would you help me get it all out so that now you can do some healing? Would you help me go through every range of emotion, but I'm still coming to Him with it? So, I would just say that sometimes if people are even misunderstanding and they blame it on God, they'll want to actually turn from God. And I would say God is a good enough God, a big enough God, that He can handle your questions. He can handle all the uncertainties. He can handle all the anger. And so just whatever you do, don't run from Him, run to Him and bring every bit of emotion to Him.
Okay, so as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the well-intentioned Christian that walks into a situation. Now, most of the time, and I know just you've taught me this, so many times when hard things happen, people just step away, not because they don't care, but because they don't know what to say. And so I would just want to encourage you that when tragedy strikes anybody, even if it's not your tightest circle, because even in your tightest circle, there will be people who don't know what to say and you would think would step forward but might not. So even if it's a secondary circle, be the person that moves towards them, and be the person that you don't have to have the right answer, but move towards them so they know they're not alone. But as I say that, I would love for you to maybe speak to how to avoid maybe being super spiritual in those moments.
Yeah.
Like, God is good, and we did that last time, but like, God brings all things together for good to those who love Him.
Right.
Like, that's not what you want to hear
Right.
in the heat of your pain or the height of your pain.
Right. In those moments, the greatest ministry you can give someone is just the gift of your presence. Just be present. Some people have greater degrees of empathy than others. But I would say that when there's that level of pain, just honestly try to feel what they're feeling. Don't try to change their feelings. Just feel with them, and then don't be a theologian in the moment, and don't try to have all the answers. But then just the security comes when you are trying to think about it theologically, and He's a good Father. And if you can just put everything in the context of what would a good father want to do? How would a good father approach this situation, this moment? How would a good father care for his or her child in this moment? And so in that, I would say it's critical to say less, to empathize more, to hurt with someone, to serve someone just to help meet their needs, and to just simply be present with them. Sometimes, honestly, it's the gift of distraction. Sometimes you can talk about other things and just help relieve their mind. One of my favorite moments of Mark, our son, is that there was, he was probably only 10 or so at this time, but there was a family in our church that had lost their father or was in the process of potentially losing their father in this moment. And we would go up to the hospital late at night to visit. And one night he asked if he could go with us. And I said, yeah, but why do you want to go?
I think it was New Year's Eve, if I remember correctly.
You're right.
Yeah.
And as a 10-year-old, he said, I know I can make them laugh. And even in grieving, what a gift is laughter. Mm-hmm. So there's just these intangibles and these human moments. Humanize the moment. Just be with someone in that moment.
I love that. And I even think about at the time that your brother did die, that you had a niece who had recently been born, and that your mom mentioned that even having a child around, just reminding the circles of life, and that yes, there is tragedy, but there's new life, and there was something that provided incredible hope, and even just to have a reason to get up in the morning and take care of a child was a gift.
Honestly, Trisha is our niece's name, and the gift that she was to our family in that moment is immeasurable. Mm-hmm. Just the ability to actually love on a child, and to have a place for your heart to attach and connect in that moment of loss was extraordinary.
Yeah. Before we kind of turn the conversation just a little bit, the one other thing that I thought of as you were sitting here of what do you say in those hard moments with people? And if you've been in those situations and you're the one who's walked through tragedy, you think, what do I wish people had said? Or maybe people did come around you and love you well in that. But I think in that, not be a theologian, but point people to God. I think the thing that I have found brings the most peace is just for people to know that, God's heart breaks with you.
Yeah.
That he didn't want that loved one to have to suffer. He didn't want that death. He created life. And as you mentioned before, sickness and disease, that was not in the Garden of Eden. That was not what he designed us to have to experience. And so that separation breaks his heart. And I think in those moments when there's just absolute mass confusion in the point of tragedy or trauma, it's just reminding people no, he actually hurts with you.
Right.
So
and I would say in those moments, oftentimes I just tell people, listen, I'm here to listen, whatever you want to talk about. And if you have questions, sometimes there are answers. And honestly, sometimes there's just not answers, not on this side of heaven. Even in the lack of answers, there still is the comfort of a Heavenly Father, of a God that has put his plan in place by sending his Son to die for us so that all of us can be healed through the resurrection. But that in this moment, I just want to simply be whatever you need me to be.
So, Chris, as we think about your experience, that is 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And it absolutely, the loss of your brother, and he was more of a father figure to you than he was just a brother. So there were some dynamics there that made that loss even
Kind of have a double impact.
Yeah. But as you look back now and just looking back and reflecting of how did you respond, and then just through seasons of life, what would you maybe want to highlight for us so that people know, okay, maybe something happened a while back and it's still causing me issues in other ways in my life. What has that sequence been, and what would you be able to say to help someone so that the pain that they've gone through is also unwasted in their life?
Yeah, so sometimes the responses, and especially in my particular situation, only being 10 years old, you're responding in ways that are kind of involuntary. There are ways that you do certain things not knowing whether it's the right thing or not, but you are just somehow, some way trying to understand it, trying to deal with it. And like for me, I mean, this is remarkable to me when I think back upon it. But shortly after Bubba's death, I asked my parents if I could move out of my room into his room. And there was just something that was just trying to be closer to him. And there was aspects of that were good. But honestly, there were aspects of that weren't so good for me, because I stepped into this room that had this huge trophy case with all of his accomplishments. And I began to, not knowing this at the time, but really feel the pressure to, in many ways, become my brother, and to kind of be my brother's substitute or replacement, and to try to, become as good at golf as he was, to help heal some of those wounds. And there were some aspects of that honestly were incredibly helpful, because it gave me something to focus on and, something that kind of drove me. But as I matured in life, there was other aspects of that created a performance identity that created a lot of pressure. And then in the middle of that, what was difficult is when a family has a tragedy, my parents were doing their own grieving. So it was difficult for them to actually be able to be there for me as a child, to be there for my sister, because they're equally devastated. And so I think this is when you need extended family. This is when you need family friends, close friends. This is why it's so important for us to truly love people well and build quality relationships so that we can be there for one another, because in many regards, that pain was too heavy and too great for my parents to carry at that time, and then know how to help me in the midst of it.
Chris, I know just statistically, for parents that lose a child,
under the age of 18, especially.
Yeah. The chance of divorce in that
skyrockets.
Yeah, and it is. It's that picture of people grieving separately, and in some ways that it's almost easier to just kind of allow yourself to not focus on the family unit that was. And so, as somebody who walked through that, if there's somebody listening today that maybe knows a family that's lost a child, or they themselves have lost a child, what would you say, from your experience, would be the things that you would say, if I could go back and help my mom or dad again, if there was a different dynamic that could have transpired, because they had their own grief, and that did leave you trying to figure it out for yourself in some ways. What are the things that you feel like could have helped in that moment?
Well, this is why it's really important to be healthy before the crisis comes, because there was already great instability and there was already some dysfunction. So it's hard to go from dysfunction to function in the midst of a tragedy. It's hard to go from unhealthy to healthy in the midst of a tragedy. But given that's where we were, I do remember, our pastor came and visited and I'm sure tried his best to be what he could be in that moment, but I don't know that we reciprocated. Sure. That we were mostly kind of Christmas/Easter Christians, but in that moment, I think what would have been a game changer is if our family would have finally said, we can't do this, and we have got to have help, and therefore we're going to turn to God, we're going to turn to God's family, we're going to ask for all the help imaginable, we're going to try to, let people minister to us. One of the things that people don't actually do well is receive. To actually let people come alongside of you for a season, invest in you, and meet your needs. There's something about our independence and something about not wanting to inconvenience people that we actually limit the amount of love that we can receive and the practical ways that people can help. And so I think that's where, whether you're currently plugged into a church or not, if there's ever a time to run to God, to run to God's people, in this moment, it's the moment where you need God the most, and then it needs to be sustained.
Chris, as you're saying that, I think about the phrase that you talk about, adults don't change until it costs them too much not to change.
Right.
So I think, it would be fantastic for us to say, you should be, strengthen your walk with God and strengthen your relationships with your families and strengthen your, all the things so you have those healthy roots and that deep structure. And obviously we believe that. But to say that to people because someday you're going to experience tragedy, for most people doesn't motivate them.
Right.
They're going to do the same thing until they get to that moment. So maybe in this context, I would add maybe to what you said, as the family of God, as people come into your space that might not be healthy, and maybe they are coming because they have experienced a tragedy, I think our tendency is to back away pretty fast. They said they didn't need anything, or hey, they didn't even return my call. I mean, they must have other people helping them.
We always say this: call me if you need me.
Yeah.
And that person's juggling everything, trying to survive, trying to keep their head above water, and now we're putting the burden on them to call us if we need them. This is where we need to, of course, politely, appropriately, but there's times you just need to show up. Yeah. There's times you just need to go the extra mile. There's times you need to do things and serve in ways and offer help even when they don't think they need it, they actually need it. And then there's times you just need to risk calling too much. Mm-hmm. You need to risk over communicating instead of under communicating. And you just need to say, listen, we're just going to be here with you. And this is something that the Jewish people have understood this maybe greater than any other people group throughout history. We see this through Jewish traditions and writings. We see it, in different ways through the biblical account. But the Jews, when someone passed away, would send someone. They would not send someone, they would send several people with them that were mourners that would stay with them for 30 days. Literally, continue to come, to continue to be present, continue to serve, continue to meet those needs, to listen. And you know what that means? It means they understand the magnitude of the loss of a loved one, and they understand the value of life, and they understand that honestly, God never intended for any of us to ever have to suffer through death. All right. And so then after the 30 days, they would have another group of people that would follow up and check in on them over the course of a year. Because every time you experience a new season of life, summer, fall, spring, winter, without a loved one, you grieve in a different way. Every time you experience a holiday without a loved one, you grieve in a new and fresh way. And so, again, we have condensed grieving into, a 1 to 2 week period, into a quick funeral service. But grieving is an ongoing process. One of the things that you have done beautifully throughout our ministry experience is when someone loses a loved one, you put it on your calendar, and then you consistently follow up with those people months later, and then on those anniversary dates. And it's just something that is that touch of, I'm thinking about you, I care about you, I'm here for you, I love you, how can I serve you?
So Chris, as we kind of maybe turn a little bit from just the actual grief and tragedy and the immediate, I know that there's a lot that you talked about. There's a lot packed into hey, I tried to become my brother and his substitute. And some of that was good to have something to focus on,
Yeah.
and some of it wasn't. Maybe let's talk a little bit about that identity piece. And that can be, the identity piece doesn't mean you have to have had a tragedy. Identity is something that I think is one of the ways the enemy loves to just get us down and distract us and keep us from being who God created us to be. But maybe speak a little bit into just how that particular tragedy impacted your identity.
Yeah, I would say when I think back upon it, the impact upon my identity is greater than I've ever been able to comprehend. That in many regards, I've been trying to deal with that every day, every month, every year. In certain ways, I remember just very strategically, like getting some pretty in-depth and intense counseling, like from 2005 to 2007. And, my brother passed away in 1981. I mean, look at but it shaped who I was. It shaped my orientation to life. Then, did another intensive of counseling from 2010 to 2012, and, did some more counseling 2018, 2019, because there are certain events that are triggers that actually will take me back to the original crisis. And so there are additional things in life that, it's a different set of circumstances, it's a different type of adversity, but it will trigger me. And it triggered me to honestly kind of trying to be the savior for my family. So by trying to become the golfer that my brother was and be a better golfer than my brother was and to win more golf tournaments than my brother won, well, that was trying to honestly heal my dad's pain. It was also trying to kind of overcome a little bit of a family dynamic of, we were the blue collar, person that didn't have the education that everyone else had, that, was an underdog, that had a little bit of a chip on our shoulder, and we just had to work harder to prove ourselves. And so there were those dynamics that this tragedy, it fueled those dynamics that were already present more.
One of the things that maybe as a question back to you, we're definitely in the boat of being proactive.
Yeah.
And you mentioned just the different points of triggers. There was that. There was also just different stages of life that we were going through, because it was like, okay, now we have children of our own. And so how do we make sure that we are as healthy as we can be moving forward? But in reality, you didn't really have any professional help or anyone even of just a biblical wise person in your life from 10 to 20. Is that accurate?
Yeah, but it's where God intervened.
Yeah.
So I remember very quickly after my brother's death, pastor came to the house, explained everything, explained salvation to me. And I made the decision intellectually. But I don't know that I fully understood that decision. When a pastor comes and your brother's passed away, and my brother had trusted Christ about a year and a half before, and I'm more thankful for that than words can truly articulate. But for me, it was, yes, of course. My brother's now gone to heaven. I want to go to heaven. Who doesn't want to go to heaven? No one wants to go to hell. And yes, I'm going to believe. But in the midst of all of the dynamics that were going on in that moment, I don't know that I fully understood. And it wasn't until I was 15 years old and literally God used my brother again, because the church where he attended was moving out of the sanctuary, and literally, how people would put their Bibles right there where the hymnals are. He had left his Bible there, and instead of it being a lost and found, when they were moving the sanctuary, someone actually opened it up, saw his name in it, found his Bible, called our family. And I'll never forget that I went up to the church and I got the Bible and I sat down on the back pew and I opened it up just to see, was there anything that he had ever written in there? And literally the first page I opened it up on is Colossians chapter 3, and it says, set your mind on the things above and not the things of this earth. And he had a star by it and said, my favorite verse. Whew. You can't make this stuff up. And then my assumption is someone told the pastor that they had found the Bible, that I had come up there, and then the pastor told the student pastor, and then the student pastor called me a week or two later, and then I went to summer camp, and it was the first time I'd ever been on a summer camp, with a church, and it was there that I truly learned and understood what it meant to place my faith in Jesus. And from there, I initiated a relationship, or I should say maybe God initiated the relationship with me. And that was the summer before my freshman year in high school. And then reluctantly, I was kind of kicking and screaming about this. I didn't want this to happen. I was planning on going to Germantown High School, but my parents sent me to a Christian private school. And so that helped. Honestly, it probably helped just in the sense of the culture and, but I remember the first time I took Bible in 9th grade, first semester, I literally made a 46 in Bible. And the teacher came to me and was like, how in the world, no one makes a 46 in Bible. All these, how did you make a 46 in Bible? And I was like, what are you talking about? It's the first time I've ever opened this book in my life. I didn't grow up in this school. And I was kind of adversarial about it and stuff. And he kind of figured it out in the moment, was like, oh gosh, he's right. He said, well, I tell you what, I can help you. I can come alongside of you. We'll get this grade up, that kind of thing. But I was always, in my experience there, a little bit on the outside just because I didn't grow up in that environment. But I would say kind of the, again, not having a lot of direct guidance. In that season, I more learned what not to do instead of what to do. And so my Christianity started to be based upon the don'ts instead of the do's. And it was like you were defining yourself by, I don't do A, I don't do B, I don't do C, versus, no, what does it mean to truly love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? What does it mean to truly love one another versus just be moral and don't do bad things?
Well, Chris, I think one of my takeaways in thinking of somebody that's watching this is, don't wait 10 years.
Yeah.
It is normal to need somebody to help you process through pain. And so as a child, you didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to know you needed it. And as your family was grieving, they didn't necessarily, that wasn't something that was kind of familiar to them either. And so just if you're struggling, why not get help so that you can be fully free and fully healthy? Chris, as we kind of think about the remaining time that we have, one of the things that you gave me some notes, you were talking about hurt, loss, and anger.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through a little bit how people would see that in the context of this and take something away helpful for their life.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Every person in life is going to experience hurt at different intervals of life. You cannot live your life good enough, well enough to avoid the fallen nature of this world, the different pains, problems and pains that exist in this world. And so what we've got to do is we've got to normalize that hurt exists, okay? But when you have some level of adversity, some trial, some test, some crisis or tragedy, and it brings hurt into your life, the reason why it hurts is because you just lost something. But in this moment, who are you going to turn to define the hurt and to define the loss? And so a lot of times what happens is when that hurt occurs, there's kind of this opportunity there where God is always present in it. He wants to be there for us. He wants to do everything he possibly can to relieve the hurt as soon as possible, to heal us as soon as possible, to redeem, to restore as soon as possible. But the enemy is also there to accuse. The enemy is the accuser of the brethren. So the first thing he's going to do is accuse God. God is not a good God to let these kind of things happen. But God didn't create these kind of things. These things happen because sin entered the world, all right? Because man chose to disobey God. And so he's going to accuse God that he's not a good God, and then he's going to accuse you that maybe you did something wrong, or maybe someone did you wrong. And when that happens, if we're not careful, we're going to allow the enemy, the liar, the accuser of the brethren, to define the defining moment. Who do you allow to define the defining moment? Either God's going to define that moment, or the liar's going to define that moment. Either it's going to be defined by the one who is truth, or defined by the one who is falsehood. All right? And so in that, now listen, it's okay to validate the feelings that it hurt. I'm all day long, I want to, we can give God our pain. We are supposed to come alongside of one another and love one another in such a way that we help people feel the pain, overcome the pain. But then when it comes to the loss, if you allow the liar, the enemy, to define the moment, the loss is permanent and it only gets worse. And he is ruthless. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so he's going to take your weakest moment and he's going to wound you in an even greater way. And he's going to cause you to be stuck in the past. But if you turn to God to define the moment, and we want to, again, not only validate feelings, but validate loss. You did lose something. But what you lost can be redeemed, both in the present tense in this life, but also can be redeemed in the life to come. Okay? And so in this, what good does it do you to allow the liar to define the moment? See, that's how brilliant he is as a liar, that he actually causes us to blame the one who is good and causes us to become the victim in such a way that we lose sight of the one who gave us the victory.
That's wasted pain.
That is wasted pain. 100% wasted pain. But if we will turn to God in this moment, then we begin to see that healing emerges. Sometimes comprehensive, like dramatic healing right there in the moment. Sometimes it just emerges. Sometimes it's the first step of healing. Sometimes it's the second step of healing. There are dramatic moments of healing. There are times that it's progressive. But at least healing emerges. When healing emerges, hope emerges. And when you have hope that there is, and this is where instead of using, the Romans 8:28 in a way that is kind of a cliche and we just kind of put it as this, little pat answer over every problem, now we can say, no, wait a second. There is truly a God who causes all things to work together for good to those that love him. And I'd much rather trust that he exists and trust that that is true than have no hope whatsoever. And so in that, real quick, if we have the hurt and we have the loss and we're allowing the liar, the enemy, to define it instead of God, the loss turns into anger. And when the loss turns into anger, guess what? We're angry at God. Now we're angry at others. We can even be angry at ourselves. And angry people are rarely loving people. And it's a type of self-destruction. And it fulfills that the enemy came to steal, kill, and destroy.
Well, I don't know that I've thought about it in that way, but a lot of times you can see people that you don't really understand the source, like where does that anger come from? And I think in a lot of ways we have to be people of empathy, and instead of being offended when we run across somebody that comes across angry, to know that there's probably a source to that anger that they may not even recognize.
Well, and that's where I would say, like, there's certain things biblically that we just need to keep on the forefront of our heart and mind, but especially in the midst of problems and pain. Maybe these are, in that regard, the two most important words. Time and time again, Scripture says, fear not. Now, what happens in the midst of crisis? We fear. What happens in the midst of tragedy? We fear. But he says time and time again, fear not. Fear is not from God. All right, perfect love drives out fear, cast out fear. And we can legitimize the emotion or the feeling of fear, but we then need to confront it and overcome it by saying, no, there is one greater than the fear. All right, Jesus is asleep in the boat, but you can wake him up and he will calm the storm. So the storm is a legitimate storm, but there is one greater than the storm. And so in that way, and this is where even these moments, you mentioned this earlier, these moments shape our identity. All right. Part of some people, their identity is they are fearful. They're fearful of everything. They're intimidated. They're overwhelmed. They're afraid of something going wrong. Versus there are people who say, wait a second, though there's a lot of pain in this world, though there's a lot of problems, ultimately I have some level of security, some level of safety that God is my heavenly Father. And that's going to create an identity that's more secure than insecure. And when I have a secure identity, that secure identity turns into a new internal dialogue. And my internal dialogue will begin to define everything about myself, and it will begin to define everything about the way I walk through the crisis and walk and overcome the crisis, and allow this crisis that's now in the past tense to actually propel me forward, actually take tragedy and turn it into triumph. And in that way, it is so important, do we speak words of life or death? And what we've got to do is we've got to learn in our worst moments, there is one speaking life to us. In our worst moments, What we've got to do is be secure instead of insecure. And in that moment, we have to take ownership upon ourselves to no longer speak victim language, but speak overcomer language. We are overcomers. We are victors in this. And then those words we use, I promise you, those words will advance us, they will heal us, and they will get us to the other side.
Well, I can think about a lot of helpful tools in terms of internal dialogue that we hopefully will bring through this podcast. So thank you for just kind of peeling the layers back and just how you walked through it. We hope that this will be helpful for you, whether this is something that you look back historically and you've experienced a tragedy, or maybe there's somebody that you love, that this might be a helpful tool to say, no matter when it has happened or what has happened, there is a God who is one of healing and restoration. And so we want every single person on this earth to be able to say that whatever has happened to them is unwasted pain, and that God has used it for good in your life. So thank you so much for joining us for this second episode. Really want to encourage you, if you have not gone and checked out the Love Works documentary, it's a story of healing and hope. You can go to the YouTube channel for Vision Video and see it starting Father's Day. You can also go to loveworksdocumentary.com, where Chris also has not only access to the documentary for free, but also some accompanying resources. So we will see you next time, and hope you guys come back and for episode 3.